Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very pleased to welcome Rick Wartzman to this New Labor Forum event to discuss his new book, his fifth book, published at the end of last year, called Still Broke, Walmart's Remarkable Transformation and the Limits of Socially Conscious Capitalism. Before we get into discussing the book, I just want to share a little background on Rick, the author. I remember Rick from the early aughts, the early 2000s, when he was working as a business editor at the LA Times. I lived in LA in those days, and I remember vividly the series of articles the LA Times published on Walmart, which won a Pulitzer Prize, with Nancy Cleland, I believe, as the lead reporter, and Rick was the editor who made all that happen. So he's had a longstanding interest in the topic of the book, that is to say. He has moved on from the world of journalism, and more recently, before taking the position he has now, which I'll tell you about in a minute, he spent 15 years at the Claremont Graduate University in Southern California, as the founding director of something called the Drucker Institute, named for Peter Drucker, a name some of you will know, who's no longer with us, but has written a lot on topics like the one this book addresses. Just this year in 2023, he left Drucker to become the co-president of a new enterprise called Bendable Labs, which is a technology consulting and research firm. So you can find out more in the usual places, but that's a little bit of background on our author. So turning to the book, and thank you for being here, Rick. Today, as I think everyone would agree, the behemoth corporation that progressives love to hate is not Walmart, it's Amazon. But for many of the same reasons that in the recent past that we had a strong animus around Walmart. Among other things, both these companies have been criticized by many, many people for treating their workers poorly, for their intransigent anti-unionism, for undercutting small businesses, by using their market power to cut prices to the point where the competition goes away. So not very long ago, and certainly at the time that LA Times series appeared back in 2003, it was Walmart that everybody worried about and focused on and, put energy into fighting. I also remember a film, some of people listening might remember this film from 2005 by Robert Greenwald called The High Cost of Low Price. There were many exposés of Walmart in books, articles, both popular and academic. So this new book documents the history of Walmart's transformation over the last decade or so, well, more like 15 years, I guess, the way you tell it, into a company that has a plausible, if not totally persuasive, claim to being socially responsible, or as the subtitle of the book puts it, socially conscious, part of socially conscious capitalism, quote unquote. Now, no one would deny that Walmart remains viciously anti-union, and I'll definitely return to that in a minute. But that, of course, does not distinguish it from any other major U.S. corporation. I mean, that's kind of how it is nowadays. So Walmart remains the nation's biggest private employer, although Amazon is catching up. It has not done so yet. And you mentioned their rivalry at one point in the book, and the current CEO, Doug McMillon's making all the Walmart executive team read the Everything Store, this early book about how Amazon got its stripes or whatever. And you also credit McMillon with the wage bumps of the mid-2010s, which we'll come back to. Walmart currently boasts that its average wage for its hourly workers is $17 an hour. Of course, that's an average, which can be misleading, but the minimum it pays today is $12 an hour, if I'm up to date. And that's a lot higher than the minimum wage in many of the places where Walmart stores are located, $7.25. the argument of the book, as I understand it, is that while things have changed quite significantly at Walmart, the change is far from sufficient, hence the title of the book, Still Broke as in, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but it is broke. So you, as I read it, you trace the origins of this change back to about 2005, almost 20 years ago, actually. I misspoke earlier, when Katrina hit New Orleans, and then CEO Lee Scott decided to use the company's vast capacity to help supply the victims of Katrina with water and a bunch of other necessities at a time when the federal government was legendarily incompetent to meet the need, and that they got a lot of points for that. But my first question is, apart from this particular moment of opportunity to create some goodwill with the public, which this definitely did, why did Walmart embark on this larger effort that you document to embrace what you call socially conscious capitalism, eventually launching all kinds of environmental initiatives and raising pay for its workers? Like, what is behind this? Why did they do it? If we could start with that.
Sure. So I think it's a confluence of things, actually. So some of it, particularly in the early days, so if you go back to 2005, and Katrina really was this kind of pivotal moment in the company's history. Some of this, like all companies, they mythologize, the story a little bit, and it sort of takes on this larger than life quality. But I do think something significant happened, and the company that had been and was being so vilified for its scale, its size, right? The curse of bigness, of business, and it suddenly used this vastness, this logistics expertise, and this giant logistics network it had to, as you said, deliver essential medicines and water and food and other supplies to this devastated region of the country in the Gulf Coast around New Orleans and so on, and got a lot of credit. And Lee Scott gave this kind of pivotal speech, and it was, I think, the first time a CEO had ever delivered an address, not only to his whole executive team, but to every, what they call associates, every frontline worker in the stores, every store. This was, broadcast to everyone. And basically he said, look, we get beat up all the time for our size. Katrina was a case where we were praised because we were able to leverage our size for good. How could we do this every day? What would it take for Walmart to do this every day? What would it mean if we could do this every day? And I think there was some, real sincerity to it. I mean, look, some of it was for PR reasons, but PR reasons that were also turning into, business problems. Lee Scott and every CEO since has wanted to, being true to Walmart's base customer, right? People who are looking for low cost goods, low price items, because maybe they're, on fixed incomes or really tight budgets themselves. At some point, right, Walmart needs to grow by expanding its customer base and kind of moving without alienating those traditional customers, getting to a kind of, more upscale customer. And part of that plan was to go into urban markets, right? Lee Scott was trying to enter New York and other urban markets. The unions were making that difficult. Others were, politicians were making that difficult because of Walmart's reputation. This was a chance to turn that around. And so I think early on, there was some PR involved, but PR for not just to feel good, but for real business reasons. And this was also a time where right around this same period, two unions began to wage, these incredible campaigns, these corporate campaigns against Walmart, and we can get into that. But Walmart also needed to combat that, and so, it turned to environmental stuff first, and has, by all accounts, while far from perfect, made a lot of strides in being a greener company, a more sustainable company. The Environmental Defense Fund, Conservation International, other large mainstream environmental groups would tell you, while not perfect, Walmart is really genuinely a sustainability leader at this point among at least large corporations. They began to give away food to food banks, and at this point have given away billions of pounds of food. They have a major initiative with Feeding America that is really important and great. They lowered the price of prescription drugs. They were instrumental in Michelle Obama's, healthier eating, healthier foods campaign, really taking lots of sugar and salt out of items on their shelves and fats and so on. And so did a lot of good. the last place they came to, because I think it's the one that was so directly antithetical to their fundamental business model, was to invest in workers.
Mhm. Good. Well, we'll talk more about the investment in workers in a bit. But so you talked a little bit about what did change, all the things you just listed, the environmental stuff, the
Yep.
food involvement, and so on. So why is it still broke? What failed? What did they fail to change? Tell us more about the thinking behind your title.
Yeah. So, I mean, the title, which they hate, of course, and to their credit, look, and there's a whole backstory to this too, but, you know, Walmart let me inside in a way that they have not let, you know, many, if any, journalists. And I actually give them a lot of credit as a company, way more than most big companies, for engaging with their critics, of which I have been one for a long time. And, you know, in full disclosure, that I wrestle with this in the book. When I was at the Drucker Institute, which you mentioned, you know, we did a pioneered a lifelong learning initiative there, and they were one of the seed funders. And I was really surprised, because I had been such a long time critic, and they clearly knew who I was, that Walmart was giving the institute which I was leading, any funding whatsoever. I literally thought, hey, maybe they're trying to buy me off or something like that. That would not be unheard of. But they turned out to be really good partners on this project. And, you know, this was their corporate philanthropy. I got to meet a bunch of Walmart executives I had never met as a journalist. Certainly when I was at the LA Times, this was a different relationship. And so I got to see inside, and I actually pitched them, and I said, look, I want to come and tell your story. Something interesting is going on here. I knew they had started to raise wages in 2015. I knew they had, you know, followed the company enough to know they had made these changes and become a greener company. You know, what was going on? Why were they doing it? Was it strictly PR? Was it business operation reasons? Was it because of outside pressure? Like, why were they doing this? What did it add up to? And I pitched them, and I said, look, I don't think you're getting your due for the strides you've taken, particularly your investment in workers, raising wages, and so on. And I want to tell that story. And who better to tell it, by the way, than one of your longtime critics? So let me inside. But if I do this, I am going to need full access. And I'm also not going to pull any punches. I'm going to talk to all your critics. I'm going to talk to the unions. I'm going to talk to United for Respect, the labor advocacy group that spun out of the Food and Commercial Workers Union. I'm going to talk to, you know, Bernie Sanders' office. I'm going to, you know, talk to everyone who still thinks you have a long way to go. And I'm going to come to my own truth. And that truth is still broke. So I think the title refers to sort of three things. One is that, you know, their workers are still broke. So after all the change, and we can talk about, you know, what the change has actually entailed, you know, to cut to the chase, the average Walmart worker still makes less than $29,000 a year. Right. And I say average because you can actually calculate that, or I could calculate that based on figures they gave me. So they would not tell me the median wage for their US workers, but I think given that the median tends to skew lower, it's fair to say that, you know, more than half of their, 1.6 million US workers, so you're talking 800,000 or more US workers don't make even $29,000 a year after all the steps they've taken. So they're still broke. In that way, Walmart, for all the strides it's taken, is still broken. It hasn't fixed this problem of providing a living wage to its workers. And then this title really refers to, I think, a whole system that's broken, that we live in a country that is really, I think, suffering from a wage crisis. You know, that Walmart is both a source of the problem as the biggest employer in the country and as such a standard setter, but is also a symbol of a much bigger problem of tens of millions of workers who, you know, get up every day, go on the job, work hard, and then often, if it's not every month, are certainly in danger, and all too many times find themselves struggling and making these terrible trade-offs, right, that we know about by all the surveying between, you know, paying for food or medicine or heating their homes or making rent. These are people who are workers, you know, they're working, and often either they are making those terrible trade-offs and or relying on public assistance just to scrape by. And so the system's broken, Walmart's broken, and certainly their workers are still broke.
Great. So one thing you mentioned as part of the explanation, I just want to return to, since it's a particular interest to us here in the labor school. You tell the history of both the two corporate campaigns that you already mentioned, Walmart Watch, which was funded by SEIU, and the UFCW's Wake Up Walmart campaign, and that both of those followed earlier efforts to actually do conventional union organizing at Walmart, efforts that were strenuously resisted by Walmart and failed miserably. And the UFCW put enormous amounts of resources into that effort to organize, what was and still is the biggest employer in the private sector in the country, and one that they saw as undercutting their long unionized supermarket base and so on. And it was a disaster. They got nowhere. And so then they turned to what one of the people you quote in the book called the air war, which, they abandoned the ground war and started doing, propaganda campaigns criticizing Walmart. And first it was the UFCW, I guess, and then SEIU got into the actors.
They were right at the same time. They each claim credit for having thought of this idea. So,
okay. So although there was some tension about that, but that's not so interesting. So they defeated unionization efforts on the ground. And maybe, I think you sort of hinted at this earlier in your comments, maybe some of the changes that they then began to implement were an effort to nail the coffin of the unions in the air war as well. Like here they had this challenge that and because these campaigns did have an impact, they reached a lot of people, and Walmart developed a very bad reputation, right? And especially among progressives, but to some extent in the wider public, even including their longtime customer base. So one explanation for this is that the unions are sort of get some of the credit. Do you think that's true, or what? How do you look at that whole question?
Look, I think there again. So when you cut to 2015, when for the first time Walmart raised its starting pay, across the company. Obviously, look, starting wages at Walmart in 2015 weren't the same as when Sam Walton ran the stores in the 60s. The market had bid up wages over time, and minimum wage laws, even very slowly at the federal level, but even at state and local level, right, wages had gone up, but they had never instituted an across the board wage increase. So why did they do it? I think it was a whole bunch of factors. There was pressure from the unions for sure, and those early campaigns were the start of it, right? In 2005, 2006, 2007. They were brutal. I mean, they were genius. Both the SEIU and the UFCW went out. They hired a bunch of mostly very young political operatives who had worked a lot on the digital sides, the early digital sides of presidential campaigns, right? Howard Dean's campaign, and and others, and John Kerry's campaign, and so on. And they brought those folks in, and they were extremely creative and clever and great at leaking damaging stuff to the media. And the effect was huge, again, particularly as Walmart was trying to reach some more upscale customers, expand into urban areas. This had a real detrimental effect on their ability to do those things. Lee Scott, the then CEO, I think, kind of paraphrasing, but called it, something like the most sophisticated, relentless corporate campaign, corporate campaigns, because they weren't done in concert. They were separate but simultaneous, ever waged. And I don't think that was hyperbole. I mean, they were really incredible, to the point now it's so interesting. And you began with Amazon. I think I still have, I'm of an age, I still have a lot of friends who would never step foot in a Walmart. Why? They will tell you because they treat their workers terrible, whatever. And I think somehow Amazon gets a pass on a lot of this, where people
recently, anyway, I think now,
so recently, but even now, people I know who are, maybe they're not super activist progressives, but would identify as progressive or whatever, would never step foot in a Walmart still, but they got 30 Amazon packages piled up outside their door every day. There is a convenience that is the consumer part of our brain that doesn't, always comport with our other values. So, anyway, just saying. But so I think, yes, I'd give the unions in those campaigns some credit for, putting Walmart down this path. There were other outside pressure points, right? And actors who applied pressure to Walmart. So You also had, in addition to the unions, and we should mention that our Walmart, now United for Respect, spun out of the Food and Commercial Workers. And this was a campaign, that wasn't trying and is not trying to, reach collective bargaining with the company, but is a way for workers to organize and have collective voice and some measure of power and try and make change, but outside of the traditional, collective bargaining structure. And so they certainly kept up in a way. It was a replay of those earlier corporate campaigns. Well, one other note, by the way, for your audience, I think this is really interesting. So the two campaigns, the UFCW's campaign, Wake Up Walmart, the goal there, if you talk to Joe Hansen, the then president of the union, was to soften up Walmart enough in in its public image and to give them, sully them enough in their public standing that it would force them to the bargaining table. At that point, their hope was still that Walmart would come to the bargaining table, at least in some of the urban markets where maybe they'd agree to the prevailing wage that the UFCW had negotiated with some of the supermarket chains. The SEIU, they weren't trying, I mean, if you believe Andy Stern, they weren't trying to encroach on the UFCW's turf and steal members or things like that. They just said, this is the biggest company in America. They represent everything wrong with corporate America. We want to sully their image because it's a way to sully all of corporate America. And to really point to the fact that corporate America writ large is not paying so many frontline workers a sufficient wage. They are not providing adequate access to healthcare, right, and so on. And so Andy had kind of a different aim. Those campaigns, our Walmart, politicians like Bernie Sanders and others who continue to take on Walmart, the interfaith community, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which Walmart is kind of a religious streak in Bentonville, Arkansas, and they listen to the nuns, right? The nuns come in and complain about how they're paying and treating people and taking on other issues, and they were a point of pressure. Journalists, right, like myself, pains with a pen, right, who are coming after them. But I think, and it took about 10 years from Katrina to 2015 to finally do the wage part of being more socially responsible, to the degree they've done any of it. But I think the biggest reason they moved on wages at all was actually a business imperative. By 2011, there's some evidence, certainly by 2013, they had cut labor costs so deeply and were holding down labor costs so much to keep profits where they wanted them, that turnover had reached, just even for retail, like epidemic proportions, right? I've heard it was as high as 200%. Some stores, there's an anecdote in the book of an executive going into a store and the turnover was 400%. Right. So, completely just unsustainable as a business. And what that does is it means shelves aren't stocked properly. So they had empty shelves. Stores were dirty. Right. That same executive who told me about the 400% turnover went into a store, looked down and asked her colleague, "Oh, when did we switch to the brown floor tiles?" And he said, "Those aren't floor tiles, that's dirt." Right? The stores were dirty. It was a mess. And as a result, Walmart's sales, their same store sales, were declining quarter after quarter. And so Doug McMillon, then a new CEO, came in and knew he had to make some investments in their workforce, including in pay, or the business was just going to be run into the ground. And so I think it was all those pressure points, public image, all those things, inside change agents, outside pressure, but also really just a business need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to come back to the our Walmart effort, which if I remember correctly, was launched in 2010, a little bit before the Occupy Wall Street and the Fight for 15, which had a very similar kind of energy. And originally I think it was the UFCW funded it pretty generously for about 5 years. And then just when, maybe not coincidentally, just when Walmart announced its first effort to raise its own minimum wage to $10 an hour, is when UFCW kind of pulled the plug and it morphed into, what is it called then? United for Respect,
Yeah, that's what it is today.
which
Yeah.
is a more independent thing, but with much less in the way of resources. So so you already said, I guess you sort of answered this, that also had an impact, like the earlier corporate.
Totally.
And
Yep.
why did they switch? Like, why did they abandon the earlier efforts, which they did do around just before our Walmart was launched?
Why did the UFCW
Yeah,
abandon?
what made them change? Because the difference was it wasn't just an air war. They did try to get
Mhm.
rank and file workers involved in our Walmart. That was the idea. Like you said, it wasn't, they'd given up on the idea of actually winning collective bargaining rights.
Right.
But they did, it was like what we call alt labor or worker center efforts in that,
Yep.
or like the Fight for 15 that SEIU did in the fast food industry, where the demand was $15 an hour in a union, but they never got anywhere close to the union. They did get $15 in a lot of places. So can you just talk a little bit more about that transition from the earlier corporate campaigns to this approach? And also, why did they pull the plug because they thought they were calling victory because of this $10?
No, I don't think so. My understanding is that there was some tension inside, and largely a new regime after Johansson left that came in and looked at the amount they were spending on the campaign. And although obviously you could say they had an effect on ultimately wages, that base wage being raised, and wages, going up at Walmart, and some other improvements, and parental leave policy that ultimately got put in, and some things like that, some better healthcare benefits. That the one thing the union was not getting were dues paying members out of this.
Right.
And so at some point, I think it's a matter of resources, and that's a strategic question,
Sure.
and a financial strategic question for a union. So that's my understanding.
Okay. I mean, I was thinking, reading your book, about the lasting effect of Walmart's success in defeating the unions.
I think that's yeah.
Well, first on the ground, then, they kind of give up all these other efforts ultimately, as, like you said, not paying off, essentially, not sustainable, given that nothing's coming in terms of union dues or membership or anything. And I wonder if that has impacted the reluctance of UFCW and other large unions to make a comparably large scale effort, like they did attempt at Walmart, to organize the new behemoth Amazon. They've been notably uninvolved in that. I mean, the Alabama campaign, that is a UFCW affiliate here in New York, the RWDSU, that took that one on at the request of the workers there. And of course, the Staten Island thing is an independent union. And so, I don't know, it seems possible that part of why they're not interested is they feel like they tried this and they got burned so badly, they're not going to do it. They're not going to make the same mistake twice or something. I wonder what you think about that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a possibility. Look, I'm not so close to the current, UFCW executive team to be able to really say with any confidence. What I would say is this, that I think generally you're really onto something, and I think this is true for the UFCW and every union, that in some ways, again, by and large, organized labor had an amazing year last year, right? Organizing activity was up, the number of filings, right, with the NLRB to call elections, and strike activity, by every measure, and some historic wins, right, and including with the JFK 8, right, the Amazon Workers Union. But I think what you're seeing, not only in the face of all of those victories and that momentum, is Amazon, Starbucks, all these other companies. What are they doing? They're using the Walmart playbook. This is the playbook that Walmart wrote. This is the playbook, and back to Sam Walton's time, right? And he borrowed it. It's a playbook. John Tate was his union consultant who helped write the playbook in the 1930s and brought it to Walmart in the 1960s. And what does this look like, right? Ruth, you know better than I. This looks like you surveil union activists, you fire them, right? You target them, you close locations that are, trying to be, organized for any pretense, whether it's plumbing issues or, sales were too slow in that store, and that's the one you close down of all the stores. Whatever it is, if somehow there's a agreement, one, and at Walmart, it was only one in the US in one tiny group of meat cutters, in Texas that ever won anything. And then you don't come to the bargaining table in good faith, right? And eventually, goes away. And if you're fined, which Walmart has been a ton, right, by the NLRB, the costs are minimal. And there's, the financial costs, the press damage is even pretty minimal. And the actual hard costs, certainly compared to going to the bargaining table and negotiating a union contract, are nothing. And so I think what you're seeing Amazon, you're seeing Howard Schultz and Starbucks, you're seeing company after company. When I look at that, I go, oh, that's the Walmart playbook.
No, I agree completely. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, the efforts have gone further at those at places like Amazon and Starbucks, and I have some ideas about why that is, but that's kind of off our topic for tonight. Than they ever got at Walmart. They have, in some ways, even though it's modest and has never come to scale, and the companies are fighting back tooth and nail, they've gotten a little bit further along, but not from UFCW's resources, right, from a very different route.
Yep.
Right. So I wanted to turn briefly to the pandemic, which for Walmart was a profit bonanza, as it was for Amazon and many other big companies, despite the supply chain problems. And of course, Walmart is famous for having mastered that whole system, but it kind of faltered, to put it mildly, during the pandemic. And they did have, as you mentioned, like some organizational bumps and profitability problems in the 2010s, but in a way, the pandemic plus the initiatives they took, of course, to try to fix them internally, like turned that around completely. And they had this, a couple of very, very good years. And then for a while, both Walmart and Amazon paid cash bonuses to their hourly workers. We all know about this. I think at Walmart, it was called thank you pay. Right. Although that went away toward, I believe, in late 2021 or so. So could you just talk a little bit about the pandemic and its effect on all this, and, how that fits your story or doesn't?
Yeah, I think it fits the story, both at Walmart and broadly. So, right, thank you pay, or what some companies called hero pay, there are two ways to look at this. And so, the Walmart way, and this is how my book opens. I was actually on a webinar listening to some Walmart executives talk very, sincerely. I think, I don't think these are bad people, inherently. And I think they are, they want to treat their workers well, and in their own minds, they've come a very long way. And so, they would talk about all the steps they took to make their workers safer, who had to come in, these essential workers, and be in their grocery stores and in their pharmacies and so on, and in their stores. And, and they took a bunch of steps. So there were sneeze guards at the cashier station, or, decals on the floor to keep people 6 feet apart, and all these steps. And then they, and they paid them, and then they paid them more. And I can't remember the total figure, but some, billions of dollars, right? Or hundreds of millions of dollars for sure in pay, right? And you sort of listen to those aggregate figures. And when you have more than 1.5 million frontline US workers, the numbers add up pretty fast, and you get to hundreds of millions, or, of dollars. I'm sure it's hundreds of millions, because then when you sit back and you go, well, what did an actual worker get? And it turned out, for, I think, a full-time worker, it was a $300 check. And it's like, that's great, but that's not life altering. It's not enough to make you, I think, want to come into an environment that, didn't feel safe. They put in some ways for people to take leave, but it was like for 2 weeks if they got sick. If it was beyond that, though, again, the workers, their lives are so financially precarious that then they're making those decisions. Do I go in and endanger myself and those around me, my fellow employees, my customers, because I don't feel great, right, if I can get into work? Or do I stay home, which is probably the right thing to do, but then I'm not going to get hours, and then I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. And so, again, Walmart would tell one story and there's a truth to it and the numbers sound big. And then when you get down to the individual level, it's a very different picture. The other thing I would mention is around worker voice. So Walmart, like a lot of companies, if you talk to them, they would say, we really understand what our workers want and need. We really listen to their voices. Well, how do you do that? Well, we have an open door policy. Anyone can go into their manager. You can escalate that all the way up to Doug McMillan, the CEO, right? You could go see him if make an appointment if you needed to, and so on. We do constant pulse surveys of all of our workers. We're really on top of what they think and feel. Obviously, that is no substitute for genuine worker voice and actual worker voice and how the people who are closest to your customers in how the business is organized, how it's managed, what their jobs are actually like and how they should be composed and the work they do, the standards they operate under and so on. And so, United for Respect actually put something on the proxy on the proxy ballot, right, and took to the annual shareholders meeting and said, we want to form a workers council that is a COVID pandemic advisory council, because there were some workers who were getting sick, and there were some workers. I don't think it was inordinate compared to the overall population or whatever. Walmart's like a city, right? 1.5 million people. So sure, some people got sick. So I'm sure some people died because of COVID in that population. They said, look, we want our voice, and just that's all this is about, is setting health policy with the company. And that was roundly rejected. And so I think it's another way that, again, and it's not just Walmart, it's far from Walmart. Companies tell themselves, we're really doing right by our workers. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on hero pay or thank you pay. You get down to the individual level, it's a few $100. Same thing. We do a lot on worker voice, open door, surveying, we're in touch, but really they don't want too much direct worker voice. And so I think you got to really investigate these claims.
Well, that's the anti-union animus's reason for being, of course, right? That they don't want the so-called third party in the room,
Right.
helping amplify those voices. You quote the book by About Our Walmart by Adam Reich and Peter Bierman, in which they find that actually a lot of workers ordinary workers are not so critical of Walmart, that they may not be thrilled to work there, but it's better than their alternatives, that they have very few options in life, and Walmart is a live option, especially given all that turnover you talked about, which, by the way, has almost as high turnover. I think it's 150% in their warehouses right now.
And Walmart's come way down by all accounts. I don't know that they won't share the figure, but the improvements they've made have helped. Yeah. Well,
and with the current shortage of labor too, especially at this level, it's something important for them. But where was I going with that? Just that so as they point out, there definitely is a group that, and that's who is part of United for Respect, right? Who are very unhappy and vocal about it. But maybe for the majority of rank and file workers, again, given a very limited menu of options, this isn't terrible as many of the critics suggest. Could you just say a little bit more about that? Why that might be?
I think it's a really great point and an important one. So to me, it speaks to several things. So first of all, one is just Walmart's scale. So people ask me all the time, do people like working at Walmart? I'm like, again, it's 1.6 million workers. So it's like plunging into a city with 1.6 million people and going like, do you like it here? Are you happy? I mean, it's so, what neighborhood am I in? Like, who am I talking to? What, how they doing that day? I mean, it's the vastness of the company makes it pretty hard to generalize. And there are lots of different experiences. There are a lot of different people who are there for different reasons. People who want part-time hours because they're in school, or they're an older worker who they're bored and they want to go back and make some, pocket money or whatever, and they're perfectly happy. There are many workers, and I would actually say as vocal as the United for Respect members are, part of the whole idea of the group was they were looking for people who actually took pride in their job in Walmart. And many really like their customers and serving them and take pride in what they do as individual workers. And these are often the United for Respect members have been at Walmart for, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years or more. They can't be that unhappy. They would have left and gone and done, if they had any option. If they really hated it, they would have gone somewhere else. So there's something they do actually find of value in the company. And then the company has improved jobs. Again, and I didn't compose the part of the subtitle of my book, Walmart's Remarkable Transformation, given their history, given where they started in their own context. They've done a lot. And I give them credit for that. They deserve credit for that. And we can talk about how and why they fall short, but they deserve some credit. So it is very mixed picture. And I think the point that people don't have a lot of alternatives, again, speaks to this other larger point of the book, which is that we as a country, as a society, right, as a polity, we have created just an army of low paid workers who serve us, whether it's serve us food or the work you're doing, take care of us and take care of our most loved ones, and teach us, and do all kinds of jobs, and can barely make ends meet with what they're paid. And so the alternatives, if I leave Walmart, where do I go? To Starbucks, and I'm not going to make $15 an hour there. Or do I go to Amazon, and yeah, they pay 15, but man, that's super creepy because they're monitoring every movement I make in the warehouse, and they're going to break my back in 2 weeks. And we have created, it isn't just Walmart. We have created an economy full of jobs. I estimate it's somewhere between 25 and 40% of the labor force. So 40 to 65 million people who are really struggling to make ends meet after going to work. Mm-hmm. That is a huge crisis in my view. And again, it leaves people without alternative.
Right. Well, and so you point out toward the end of the book that unless there's that the companies are only going to do so much without a push from law, public policy, government, that there's, they've done some change, they've made some changes, as you say, but there's a long way to go. And and we have this country with, like you just said, many working people who don't earn a living wage, inequality skyrocketing, labor law broken. So could you say a little bit more about what it would take to?
Yeah. I think, So look, this is kind of where I came out at the end of Still Broke, which is, and it points to the limits of socially conscious capitalism. The kind of, I don't know, the problem isn't that, right, people say, oh, Walmart's the evil empire or whatever. The problem isn't, at least now, that Walmart's evil. The problem is that this is what, socially conscious capitalism has come to look like for a big retailer. And so we as a society have accepted that as good or good enough. And in fact, Walmart in many quarters is now praised as, right, having done the right thing. And you can look at the sources, but, they're on the Change the World list, from Fortune magazine for having raised wages, right? While politicians are just talking about raising the minimum wage, Walmart did it. And as you pointed out, they're way over the minimum wage now with their starting pay in a number of markets that they serve. And so, I look at that and I say, the problem is that this is a company that's actually, for business reasons, for PR reasons, for, people trying to do the right thing reasons. I believe all of those are factors. But at the end of the day, even with all that, the average Walmart worker, more than half of their workers, are not making $29,000 a year. They're not making a living wage. There are all too many still on, food stamps and Medicaid. There are all too many still struggling. And this is for a company that's trying. And so what that said to me is, not only Walmart, but corporate America overall will never go far enough, fast enough on its own. And the only solution to this crisis is a government mandated living wage. I call for $20 an hour. I think that needs to be phased in. I'm not a fool. I don't think, certainly the current Congress is not about to do that. But I do think, I do think that's what it's going to take, is some kind of large government intervention. This is a crisis. We've dug a hole over 50 years of wage stagnation. And it's kind of, to me, like climate change. Like, there's no time for incrementalism anymore.
Good. Okay, we have a couple questions that have come in through the chat from the audience. So let me read you a couple of those. The first one is from someone called Peter Fugel. Pardon me if I mispronounced that. He asks this: like other big retailers, Walmart has been criticized for not giving workers enough hours and scheduling them for unpredictable shifts. I think everybody listening to this is familiar with that problem. In recent years, Walmart announced scheduling changes, including increasing the share of full-time jobs and making it easier for workers to swap shifts. Do you have a sense of how well Walmart has delivered on promises to improve schedules for hourly workers? Are these changes evidence of a durable shift, or are they temporary patches on the same low commitment model that they've reigned historically?
Yep. So great question. So Walmart has, in fact, I think, made largely good on the promise of providing more stability in scheduling, that is giving much more advanced notice. And I couldn't tell you the exact figure now, but I think it's more than 2 weeks, and they are, headed. They've gone a long way in that direction. They've also really transformed to using much more full-time labor and a lot less part-time labor. It's now, I think it's over 2/3 full-time labor, which is good. Although full-time, it should be noted, there is 36 hours a week is considered full-time. That's the average full-time, actually. And so it's not even 40. But in that side of the moving definitely in the right direction. They also talked about providing not only more stability, but more flexibility. And they were designing a scheduling system that would allow employees to swap shifts easily. So, my kid got sick, or I wanted to go see their soccer game on Wednesday, and you had a similar job, Ruth, and I could go on and we could arrange to sort of swap shifts, and then I could come in later that day and you could take my shift or whatever. That part, last I checked in, and again, this would have been a little while, that was proving a technological and logistical challenge that they were not happy with the progress they had made. And they admitted that part of the promise they were not nearly as far along on. And I don't think this is fleeting. I think that, again, these investments they've seen, it has cut down on their turnover a lot. It has helped. I think they've seen a return on investment that they've, in the investments they've made in their workers, both in pay and in changing things like scheduling, in training, creating more career opportunities. Again, all good things. So I don't think it's a blip. And I, look, a new CEO could do anything, but as long as Doug is there, I don't see that changing.
I remember that they also announced that they were going to offer paid parental leave for full-time workers, which means those 36 hours a week people.
Right.
So increasing the proportion of work, a lot of companies offer it to full-time workers, but they hardly have any full-time workers. So
right.
Those two things are on the same track is another little step forward. Okay, we have another question from Diane, doesn't give her last name, asking, do you think the Walmart workers would be interested in joining the Poor People's Campaign or any other organization where they'd collectively fight for improving their working lives? Did you get a sense of where they stand politically? Well, Working for Respect, United for Respect is sort of one such thing, but
I would say, that certainly I would say the answer is yes. But I would also say that their politics are, and I think some of this was in the Reich and Bierman book, their politics are not as predictable as you might assume, or I might have assumed. I'll put it on myself. I can't remember exactly. The data's in their wonderful book, but as I remember it, and it's been a while, but as I remember it, there were a bunch of Trump supporters and there were a bunch of Clinton supporters, and it was kind of all over the place politically. But I do think certainly those who are allied with United for Respect, if they're not already aligned as an organization with the Poor People's Campaign, it would certainly feel very in step. And I know that they are allied with, worker centers and others, similarly minded. So.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask you a couple more of my own, or anyway, one more. Maybe we'll have time for two. You mentioned in the book, and I remember this vividly, that lawsuit, the class action suit about gender discrimination. This is more in the managerial ranks.
Yeah.
And of course, the Supreme Court, decided against the plaintiffs. In that case, Walmart didn't have to do anything about that. Is that ongoing as an issue? Have they made any progress on they didn't have to pay any money because of the lawsuit, but have they addressed that problem, which I think was quite well documented by the attorneys bringing the suit?
Yeah.
At all as part of this move toward more socially conscious capitalism?
I think so. I mean, look, I think in this way, my sense is yes. I didn't hear that as a particular issue. I think, and what that lawsuit also showed, look, that the problem there was systemic in terms of pay. A lot of the really egregious kind of anecdotal things of what managers would say to individual, women employees, which were just horrendous things coming out of their mouths. That probably still, it's probably less. First of all, we're 2 decades down the road as a society. And even if those beliefs are held, at least in some circles, at least people know not to say those things as much. I think there was a generation of store manager too. Even then, the last of the, Sam Walton kind of, sort of buddies who were hanging on, who were, part of an old boy Southern culture. And I think a lot of that's probably washed out at this point. And a lot of it probably depends on who your store manager is. On some level, Walmart's got about 5,000 locations when you include Sam's Clubs. And I think your experience as a worker really depends on, do you have a good store manager and who's, a good person and creating pathways? And even if your pay isn't great, they're playing within the system, it's a pretty good work experience day to day. And you get a toxic manager, and there's some in a system of 5,000, it's probably horrendous. And if you're a woman, and you're probably dealing with a lot of stuff like that still, but I don't sense it's a systemic a problem.
Okay. Now we have very little time left, but let me at least offer one question from the chat.
Sure.
Ali Patonic from United Steelworkers asks, Walmart has a supplier code of conduct that may be a source of power for workers in supply chains if we believe that Walmart would rather fix problems where they, quote, play in other sandboxes and not their own. Do you observe any material gains won by workers in their supply chains, and have their board members felt any pressure on that front?
I know it's an area, I don't know a ton about it. Certainly my focus was on their US frontline workers and the changes there. I do know it's an issue they pay attention to. Part of this comes under Walmart, and this goes to sort of the socially conscious capitalism part of the title. They care a lot about ESG. They care a lot about, they care a lot about what Michael Porter at Harvard Business School calls shared value, right? Doug was right after Jamie Dimon, the chair of the Business Roundtable that had just signed its stakeholder capitalism purpose of a corporation letter. So part of the idea of having, meeting labor standards and, internationally and across your supply chain, to some, whatever those levels are, that the ESG watchdogs pay attention to. Walmart cares a lot about that, and they care about how they're rated. And I know they have ongoing dialogues with the NGOs that focus on those issues. I couldn't tell you, whether they score super high or super terrible, but I know that they pay attention to it, and I know they're in ongoing dialogues with those NGOs for sure.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're at time, but thank you so much for this very fascinating book and the conversation about it. And I hope whoever's listening will check out the book itself, where you can learn in much more detail more about all this. So thank you so much, Rick. And I hope the book gets a big audience.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it, and great to see you.